My goodness gracious.
Alex Udell, this is a really good question, Vince. You want to go and read that one? It's a really good question.
Alex says, do you think Notre Dame can or should do anything to make Notre Dame Stadium a more raucous atmosphere? Seems too tame for visiting teams compared to when Notre Dame travels. That is a very interesting question because that is the age-old question at Notre Dame. Look, I've been covering Notre Dame since 2004. And obviously, I've been a Notre Dame fan my whole life. And whenever people talk about Notre Dame Stadium and they talk about their complaints, and I've seen them over in our comment section multiple times of guys complaining about Notre Dame Stadium. And there's a certain demographic of Notre Dame fan that's not going anywhere anytime soon. Okay. I'm not going there this time. Okay. I'm just not going to. But they insist on staying seated the whole time. They insist on people around them staying seated and being quiet, and they'll get the ushers involved and things of that nature. I get all that. And the problem is there's nothing that Notre Dame can do to change that.
Yes, they can. They can tell the ushers, if people are complaining about people staying up a football game, you tell them there's nothing wrong with that and move on. And that is because the problem is then the ushers get involved and tell people to sit down. That's the problem.
They do. You're right.
Look, this is a football game. What did you think people were going to do at a football game? Right? It's like, say, what? I got hit with a baseball. I'm mad. You went to a baseball game. You sat where there wasn't a fence in front of you. Sure. Like you had to know this was a possibility, right? I agree with
you that Notre Dame is complicit.
Yes.
I agree.
Because hey, you know what? If I know I complain about something, I'm not going to do anything about it. Then guess what? I'm not going to complain about it. I'm just going to. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to stop coming. Which I'm like, okay, cool.
Or buy a suite, because those people are usually the wealthy people that have been there forever.
Right.
Go buy a suite.
I have a couple comments on this one, Vince. Number one, yes, there are things Notre Dame can do. We just mentioned some. I think that Notre Dame also prices out of some more traditional fans that would be a little bit more excited. And I said I had to get friends tickets because they can't afford to get tickets. So when I come across someone, hey, you got some tickets, somebody wants tickets, and I give them out, and but like you price yourself out of those kind of fans, of that dad that's going to bring his 4 kids, and they'd probably be a little bit louder and spend a little bit more money, but that's not the element that Notre Dame seems to want to go for. And I think they need to do things where maybe you don't. I don't know how this would work, but is there a way you can not have so many tickets getting on the secondary market? You know what I mean? Things like that, which then all of a sudden the price gouging starts, and all of a sudden, like you said, the other thing obviously is not trying, and I don't know how you do this, but try to find ways to make sure that when those other big opponents come to town, that you've tried to find ways to make sure that you're ensuring that Notre Dame fans actually get those tickets first. But here's the other thing. What we have to understand is whenever Notre Dame travels, the opposing team is a big-time program, right? So Notre Dame is always a big game when they travel. It's not the same case when Duke comes to Notre Dame, right? The Georgia crowd, the Texas crowd in 2015, Vince, that was a loud crowd.
Mm-hmm.
The Michigan game in 2018, that was a loud crowd. Notre Dame and USC in 2015, I thought was a loud crowd, because you know what those were? Big games.
Yeah.
And Notre Dame was good.
And the night games are loud and raucous because those are the big games, right? And
I would be curious and this is an honest question, so people who attended games back in the 80s, was the Air Force game super loud? This is a genuine question. Like, I don't know the answer to this. I know Miami was loud because I've watched that game before, and it was crazy and raucous. But of course, it was just like if Alabama came to Notre Dame next year, and if Notre Dame was smart enough to not allow Alabama fans to overtake the stadium, that place would be wild. My question would be that. The other thing too is, let's not forget, there's usually a lot more students at an Alabama game or an Ohio State game than there are Notre Dame students. And they could allow every Notre Dame student to go to the game, and there still would be a lot more of those, just because Notre Dame's such a smaller school.
Exactly. And they offer tickets to everybody. Not everybody buys them.
Yeah.
But the student section.
So I think that to me, it's also about, you haven't had a lot of big games at Notre Dame in recent seasons. The Clemson game this year, had it been
a full stadium
would have been wild.
Yes.
It would have been crazy, especially because it was a good game. It was a great game.
Yes.
That place would have been wild. So, but I do think so. Along with some of the changes I think Notre Dame can make, I do think there are some things that go into it as far as the quality. Where I've heard people say that what what Alex said, which is fair, is like, it always seems like when Notre Dame goes on the road, those crowds are always really loud and wild. Yeah, because they're playing Notre Dame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If they were playing Duke, it wouldn't be that wild. Just like it's not wild at Notre Dame when Notre Dame plays Duke.
Well, and I will say that Notre Dame, bringing in the Jumbotron and a lot, having the ribbon boards and the way that they built up the 3 new buildings, the sound stays in.
Yeah.
I mean, so
a lot better.
So Notre Dame, and they've upgraded the sound system, and they've done some things, I think, to make it a more raucous atmosphere.
I remember in 2015 is when they first started building the new stuff, right? And I remember being on the field at the end of that Texas game and being like, I don't think the stadium's ever been this loud.
Yeah.
Like, because, we're there at the end of games after they've won some big games before. Sure. Like, I don't think I've ever heard the stadium this loud. Part of it was because it was Texas, but the other part of it is because you could feel the sound coming back in instead of just escaping out like it had in the traditional bowl.
Yep.
And so like Michigan, for example, the way that I was told that the way that Michigan built their press box, the windows was built in a way to where it reverberates sound back into the stadium.
They're like this.
Right. And so that's how Notre Dame has done some stuff that way to make it, to amplify the sound in that regard.
Yes.
But I also think that the opponent is going to be a part of that. I mean, I thought the Michigan game 2018, I mean, you could feel the stadium shaking. You rarely feel that at Notre Dame. Mm-hmm. You could feel the stadium shaking. When Brandon Wimbush threw that pass to Chris Fink, that place was going nuts. So I do think the opponent matters. And let's be honest, Notre Dame's home schedule the last few years has been pretty lame.
Mm-hmm.
And the one year they would have had an awesome home game.
Last year, they couldn't even fill it.
They couldn't fill it because of COVID. Right.
Yeah.
It wasn't Notre Dame's fault.
Right.